I walked past our neighbor's window and heard my fiancée laughing inside. Then I heard her say, "Don't worry, he never checks." That's when I looked through the glass and saw. I did not plan to walk home that night. The car was working fine, the weather was tolerable, and I had no reason to take the long route through the neighborhood. The decision happened for no meaningful reason at all, which is probably why everything that followed felt so unreal. I parked a few blocks away after noticing traffic piling up near the main road, thinking the walk would clear my head before I got home. My name is Samuel Wright, and at the time I believed I had a predictable life. I lived with my fiancée Sophie Turner in a rented house on a quiet street, where nothing happened without everyone knowing about it. We had been together long enough to fall into routines that felt permanent. She cooked more than I did. I paid most of the bills. We talked about moving next year. We talked about kids without any urgency. Everything felt stable. That illusion cracked the moment I reached the corner near Alan Brooks' house. Alan lived 3 houses down from us. He was friendly in the shallow way neighbors often are, the kind of man who waved, borrowed tools, and hosted casual gatherings that blurred into background noise. I never disliked him, but I never trusted him either. There was always something slightly performative about the way he spoke, as if he enjoyed audiences even when none were present. As I passed his front yard, I heard laughter coming from inside his house. That alone meant nothing. Alan hosted people all the time. Then I recognized the laugh. It was Sophie's. I slowed my steps without realizing it. My first instinct was not suspicion, but confusion. Sophie had told me she would be home early that evening. She mentioned stopping by the grocery store and then heading back to cook dinner. There had been no mention of neighbors or plans or changes. I told myself it could be harmless. Maybe she ran into someone while walking. Maybe she stopped to say hello. That explanation held for exactly 3 seconds, until I heard her voice clearly enough to understand the tone. She sounded relaxed, amused, comfortable in a way she never was with strangers. The laugh faded into conversation, and then I heard her say something that did not sound playful or impulsive. It sounded rehearsed. She said that I never checked anything. The way she said it mattered more than the words. There was no hesitation, no nervous edge, no concern about being overheard. It was stated as a known fact, something already tested and confirmed. I stopped walking. I stood there long enough for logic to start failing me. My heart sped up, but my thoughts slowed down. I did not feel angry yet. I felt alert, like something inside me had switched from passive to active without my permission. I took one step closer to the house. Alan's living room window faced the street, partially covered by thin curtains that did more for decoration than privacy. The lights inside were bright. The sound of voices carried easily through the glass. I should have turned away. I knew that even then. Once you see something, you cannot unsee it, and I understood that on a basic level. Still, my body moved forward before my conscience could intervene. I looked through the window. Sophie was sitting on Alan's couch with her shoes off, her legs tucked under her in a position she only used when she was completely comfortable. Her coat was not on her shoulders. It was hung neatly near the door. Her bag was placed beside the couch, open, with her phone connected to a charger that clearly did not belong to her. She was not visiting. She was settled. Alan stood near the kitchen counter, leaning casually, watching her the way people watch something familiar. He did not look surprised by her presence. He did not look cautious. He looked like this was normal. That was when I noticed Bruce Keller. Bruce stood near the hallway, holding a drink, listening rather than speaking. I recognized him immediately. He worked with Sophie. I had met him once at a company event months earlier. At the time, I thought nothing of him. Now, he reacted to Sophie's comment with a knowing expression that made my stomach tighten. He smiled. Not at her. At the situation. That was the moment everything rearranged itself in my head. This was not an accident. This was not a single mistake. This was not something that happened because emotions got complicated. This was routine. I stayed there longer than I should have. I watched Sophie stand up and walk into Alan's kitchen without asking, opening cabinets as if she knew exactly where everything was. I watched Alan follow her, close enough that there was no personal space left between them. I watched Bruce glance toward the window briefly, his eyes passing over the glass without recognition, and I wondered how many times I had walked past this same house unaware. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make noise, my mind racing through past weeks and months. Late errands. Vague explanations. Times she said she would be home and arrived later than expected without urgency. Moments I dismissed because questioning them felt unnecessary. She was right. I never checked. I walked away from the house with my pulse pounding in my ears, forcing myself to keep moving instead of running. The street felt different now. The houses felt closer together. Every window looked like a potential witness to something I did not know. By the time I reached my own front door, I was no longer confused. I was methodical. I did not go inside immediately. I stood on the porch and replayed what I had seen in precise detail. not allowing myself to soften it or reinterpret it. I knew that if I confronted Sophie immediately, I would learn nothing beyond what she wanted me to hear. I also knew that whatever was happening involved more people than just Alan. Inside the house, everything looked the same. Her shoes were not by the door. Her keys were not on the counter. The quiet confirmed what I already knew. I checked the shared calendar on my phone. No changes. No notes. No hints. I sat down at the table and forced myself to breathe slowly, grounding myself in small, controllable actions. I made a mental list. Who knew? How long it might have been happening? What else I had missed? The realization that hurt the most was not that she was with someone else. It was that she was confident I would never notice. That confidence does not come from one successful lie. It comes from repeated proof. I heard her key in the door almost an hour later. I stayed seated. I did not move. I did not greet her. I watched her enter the room, her expression neutral, already prepared for whatever version of the evening she planned to present. She smiled when she saw me, completely at ease. That smile told me everything I needed to know about how she viewed me. I understood then that what I saw through Alan's window was only the surface. Whatever Sophie was involved in was bigger, more organized, and far more intentional than I had imagined. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I wanted the truth, I would have to let her believe she was still in control. The night after I saw Sophie through Alan's window did not end with a confrontation. I went to bed late, pretending to scroll through my phone while my mind worked nonstop. Sophie moved around the house like nothing had changed. She talked about her day, about errands, about small frustrations at work. Every detail she offered felt pre-selected. Nothing was spontaneous. Nothing required follow-up. That alone confirmed something important. She was not improvising. She was managing. The next morning, she left earlier than usual. She said she had a meeting. I nodded and wished her a good day, then waited in the kitchen long after her car disappeared down the street. When the house finally went quiet, I started noticing things that had always been there, but never mattered before. Her laptop was closed but warm. Her bag was lighter than usual. The shared desk drawer was missing a folder. I did not search aggressively. I did not open everything. I limited myself to what was already exposed. That decision mattered later. By noon, I had identified 3 things that did not line up. Shared expenses had shifted slightly over the last 2 months. Grocery charges appeared at times when she said she had already eaten. Fuel expenses appeared on days she claimed to be working late at the office. None of it was dramatic. That was the problem. It was designed to be invisible. I left the house and walked the neighborhood instead of driving. I needed to see how people looked at me when Sophie was not around. The first person I ran into was Martin Hale, who lived across the street. He was retired, observant, and usually eager to talk. That day, he seemed distracted. He asked how things were going, then nodded before I finished answering, as if the outcome was already known. 2 houses down, Elaine Foster waved and smiled in a way that felt careful. Her expression suggested sympathy rather than friendliness. I noticed it immediately. By the time I reached the corner, I understood something uncomfortable. Whatever Sophie was doing had started to leak. People knew pieces of something. They just did not know what role I played in it. That afternoon, I received a message from Dana Lewis, a woman Sophie worked with. We were not close, but we had met enough times that the message did not feel inappropriate on the surface. She asked if everything was okay at home. The wording was neutral, but the timing was not. I replied briefly and politely. I did not ask why she was asking. The response came faster than expected. Dana apologized and said she assumed Sophie had already talked to me. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else she wrote. Assumed she had already talked to me about what? That evening, Sophie came home later than usual again. She placed her bag down and went straight to the bathroom, avoiding eye contact until she had time to reset herself. When she returned, she acted normal, but the performance had small cracks now that I knew how to look. She watched my face while she spoke. She avoided specifics. She filled silence quickly. I mentioned Alan casually, pretending it was a passing thought. I said I had seen his lights on late recently and wondered if he was hosting something. Sophie responded too quickly. She said Alan always had people over and changed the subject immediately. That reaction told me more than anger ever could. Over the next few days, I started mapping behavior rather than spying. I tracked timing, not movement. I watched conversations, not messages. I noticed how often Sophie referenced people who never appeared in her stories before, and how often she dismissed details that could be verified. I also noticed that Bruce Keller's name came up more than it should have. Always indirectly. Always casually. He was framed as background noise, which meant he was not. On Thursday evening, something shifted. I was returning home when I saw Sophie's car parked near Lydia Moore's house, 2 streets away. Lydia was another neighbor, recently divorced, often included in social gatherings. Sophie had never mentioned visiting her. I parked farther down the road and walked past. The lights were on. Laughter carried through the open window. I did not look inside this time. I went home and waited. Sophie returned almost an hour later, carrying nothing, offering a vague explanation about dropping something off. She did not expect questions, and she did not receive them. That night, I checked the shared bank account again and noticed a pending charge tied to a service I did not recognize. The amount was not large, but the pattern was familiar now. It was a test expense, something meant to be unnoticed. The following day, I ran into Karen Holt, an old friend of ours, at a cafe near my workplace. The meeting was accidental, but her reaction was not. She hesitated when she saw me, then sat down without asking. She talked too much. She mentioned Sophie. She mentioned stress. She mentioned needing space. She implied things without stating them directly. I listened carefully and said very little. Karen believed Sophie was planning a transition. That word mattered. Not a breakup. Not a confrontation. A transition. One that involved securing housing, support, and narrative control before making any changes official. Karen assumed I was aware. When I got back to work, I realized something else. Sophie had not just prepared one version of reality. She had prepared several. Each one adjusted slightly, depending on who was listening. To some people, I was absent. To others, I was difficult. To others, I was temporary. That weekend, I decided to test how insulated the situation really was. I attended a small neighborhood gathering Sophie had encouraged me to skip. I arrived alone and stayed quiet. Conversation slowed when I approached. Topics shifted. People filled gaps with polite comments that avoided substance. Then I spoke to Oliver Reed, a man I barely knew but who had no reason to lie to me. He asked how long Sophie and I planned to stay in the house. The question was framed casually, but it assumed uncertainty. I asked him why he thought we might be moving. He looked confused. He said Sophie mentioned exploring options. That was the moment clarity replaced doubt completely. Sophie had been rehearsing her exit out loud. When I got home that night, Sophie noticed the change immediately. I was calmer. I was slower to respond. I was no longer reactive. She tried to fill the space with normality, but normality requires shared belief, and that belief was gone. I did not confront her. I did not accuse her. I did not demand anything. Instead, I opened a new account in my name only. I transferred my portion of shared funds quietly and left the rest untouched. I canceled one shared subscription and left others active. I wanted the changes to be noticeable, but not alarming. Control only works when people believe it is invisible. By the end of the week, Sophie began adjusting her behavior. She became more attentive, more present, more careful. That change confirmed everything. People do not correct what they do not believe is threatened. I understood now that what I saw through Alan's window was not betrayal alone. It was the surface of a structure built over time, reinforced by repetition and confidence. And I understood something else just as clearly. The moment Sophie realized I was no longer predictable, the entire system would collapse. I just needed to decide when to let that happen. Once I understood that Sophie's confidence depended on my silence, everything became simpler. I stopped wondering whether I was wrong. I stopped trying to reconcile who I thought she was with what I was seeing. The pattern was complete. All that remained was deciding where to apply pressure first. I started with money, because money leaves records even when people try to stay quiet. On Monday morning, I contacted the bank and separated my income from the shared account entirely. I did not touch what remained. I wanted the balance to stay visible so Sophie would notice it without feeling attacked. I changed nothing else that day. I went to work, answered emails, and kept my routine intact. That evening, Sophie noticed the change. She did not mention it directly. Instead, she asked if something had gone wrong with payroll. She asked if I had changed banks. She asked if everything was okay at work. Each question circled the same point without touching it. I told her everything was fine. The next shift came faster than I expected. On Wednesday, Elaine Foster knocked on my door while Sophie was out. She said she needed to return something Sophie had lent her. The item itself was insignificant. The visit was not. Elaine looked uncomfortable standing in my entryway. She asked how things were going between Sophie and me, then immediately apologized for asking. She said people had been confused lately. She said there were mixed signals. I let her talk. Elaine believed Sophie was preparing to move. She believed I already knew. She believed the neighborhood had been informed gradually so nothing would feel sudden when it happened. She said this carefully, as if trying not to betray confidence, but she had already said enough. After she left, I sat down and wrote everything out on paper. Not emotionally, structurally. Names, dates, places, who thought what, who assumed what. Patterns emerge faster when they are written instead of remembered. That list grew longer than I expected. 2 days later, I saw Bruce Keller outside the grocery store near my office. He recognized me immediately. He hesitated before approaching, then committed to the interaction as if he had rehearsed it. He asked how I was doing. He He said work had been stressful. He said Sophie mentioned I had been busy lately. Every sentence assumed shared context. I asked him directly whether he believed Sophie and I were still together. Bruce paused longer than was natural. Then he said he thought things were complicated. That answer ended the last remaining doubt. That evening, I made my first visible move. I attended a small gathering at Alan Brooks' house. I had been invited weeks earlier and declined at the time. This time, I showed up unannounced. I was polite. I was calm. I acted like someone who belonged there. The room went quiet when I walked in. Alan looked genuinely startled. He recovered quickly, but the delay mattered. Sophie was not there yet. That mattered too. I greeted people individually. I shook hands. I accepted a drink and stood where I could be seen without dominating the room. I did not accuse anyone. I did not ask questions. I simply existed in a space where I had been carefully excluded. When Sophie arrived, the shift in her posture was immediate. She froze for half a second before forcing herself to move normally. She smiled at me in a way that would have fooled me a week earlier. Now it only confirmed how well she had practiced. I stayed for 20 minutes. Long enough to disrupt expectations. Long enough to let people notice the tension without explanation. Then I left without saying goodbye. The next morning, my phone started ringing. Karen Holt called first. She asked what I was doing. She said Sophie was upset. She said I should talk to her before things got out of hand. She framed it as concern. It was actually panic. I told Karen I was not angry. I told her I was paying attention. That afternoon, Dana Lewis messaged again. She said Sophie had taken the day off unexpectedly. She asked whether I knew where Sophie was. I told her I did not. Sophie came home late that night. She did not pretend anymore. She asked why I had gone to Alan's house. She asked why people were calling her. She asked why money had moved. I told her I knew about the window. I told her I knew she had been planning a transition. I told her the neighborhood already believed a version of events that did not include me. I said this calmly. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer ultimatums. Her reaction was not remorse. It was recalculation. She shifted strategies immediately. She admitted nothing directly, but reframed everything. She suggested misunderstandings. She implied emotional distance. She positioned herself as someone responding to circumstances rather than creating them. That was when I made my second, irreversible move. I forwarded documentation. Not publicly. Selectively. I sent proof of shared expenses and timelines to Karen. I sent dates and inconsistencies to Dana. I sent a neutral explanation to Oliver Reed clarifying that I was not moving and had not agreed to any changes. I did not insult Sophie. I did not accuse her of anything illegal. I corrected assumptions. The effect was immediate. By the end of the week, Sophie's support system began collapsing. People do not like realizing they have been used to stabilize someone else's deception. Alan stopped hosting gatherings. Bruce avoided shared spaces at work. Karen stopped calling. Then the most unexpected consequence arrived. My landlord contacted me. He said Sophie had inquired about removing her name from the lease early. He said she implied mutual consent. He said he needed confirmation. That conversation ended any possibility of reconciliation. I informed him that no consent had been given. I requested documentation of Sophie's inquiry. I scheduled a meeting. When Sophie found out, her composure finally broke. She accused me of trapping her. She accused me of sabotaging her plans. She accused me of changing without warning. I told her I had not changed. I had simply stopped being useful to a plan I never agreed to. That night, she packed a bag and left. Not dramatically. Not permanently. She left to stay with someone who believed her version of events. That list was shrinking fast. I stayed in the house alone for the first time in years. The silence felt different now. It was not absence. It was clarity. The next day, Alan Brooks sold his car and stopped parking in front of his house. Bruce Keller requested a department transfer. Elaine Foster stopped waving. The system was collapsing under its own weight. And Sophie still believed she could contain it. She was wrong. Once Sophie left the house with a bag that was clearly meant to last longer than a night, the situation stopped being theoretical. It stopped being emotional. It became administrative, social, and legal in ways she had clearly not planned for. She assumed departure meant freedom. She did not understand that departure without control creates exposure. The first consequence arrived the following morning when the landlord emailed both of us. He attached Sophie's written request to be removed from the lease and his response denying the request due to lack of mutual consent. He asked us to confirm our intentions within 5 business days. Sophie forwarded the email to me with a message that framed the situation as temporary confusion. She suggested we talk later and figure out something fair. I replied with one sentence stating that all communication regarding housing should go through the landlord moving forward. That ended casual discussion. By midweek, Sophie's absence was noticeable. Neighbors asked questions without asking them directly. Alan Brooks did not leave his house. The gatherings that once defined the street stopped entirely. People do not enjoy proximity to situations that remind them of their own poor judgment. On Thursday afternoon, I met with the landlord in person. I brought documentation showing that I had covered the majority of the rent for over a year. I brought proof of income. I brought a timeline that made it clear I intended to remain in the house. The landlord listened carefully and asked few questions. He approved my request to continue the lease alone at renewal. He documented Sophie's intent to vacate without penalty to me. That decision shifted the balance more than Sophie realized. When she found out, she reacted badly. She arrived at the house unannounced that evening, expecting access. I had already changed the locks with the landlord's approval. I stood inside and watched her through the door window while she knocked. Her posture was defensive rather than apologetic. She believed confrontation would restore leverage. I opened the door enough to speak and no further. I told her the lease situation was settled. I told her her remaining belongings could be collected by appointment. I told her the conversation was over. She accused me of punishing her. She accused me of humiliating her. She accused me of turning people against her. I did not respond. People confuse silence with weakness when they have relied on noise for control. The next consequence unfolded at her workplace. Dana Lewis contacted me again, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Sophie had taken additional time off without approval. She had requested schedule changes that conflicted with existing commitments. She had attempted to frame personal stress as professional accommodation. That approach failed. Bruce Keller had already requested a transfer, citing discomfort. Management began asking questions Sophie could not answer consistently. When personal narratives collapse, institutions do not step in to protect feelings. Sophie was placed on review. By the end of the week, Karen Holt stopped responding to Sophie's messages. Karen had been used as emotional cover, and she finally recognized it. That realization hurt her more than anything Sophie had done intentionally. The social collapse was not loud. It was quiet and systematic. Invitations stopped. Conversations shortened. People who once offered sympathy stopped offering access. Sophie tried one final approach. She emailed me a long message framed as reflection. She acknowledged mistakes without naming them. She expressed regret without responsibility. She suggested mediation. I replied with a request that all further communication go through email only and relate strictly to logistics. I included a list of dates when she could collect her remaining belongings. She did not respond. 2 weeks later, she came with Lydia Moore to collect her things. Lydia avoided eye contact. Sophie moved through the house carefully, as if walking through a place that no longer recognized her. She took clothes. She took books. She hesitated over items she assumed were shared and realized too late that assumptions were no longer valid. I observed quietly from the kitchen and documented what left the house. She did not take the engagement ring. That decision surprised me until I understood it. The ring represented a version of the future she could no longer explain to anyone without contradiction. The final consequence arrived unexpectedly. Alan Brooks put his house up for sale. The timing was not coincidental. His reputation on the street had been damaged in ways real estate agents cannot easily repair. He needed distance from a narrative he could not rewrite. When the sale sign appeared, Sophie stopped contacting me entirely. Her last message came a month later. She informed me she had moved to a different part of the city. She asked for confirmation that no further financial ties remained between us. I confirmed in writing. That was the last exchange. Life did not improve immediately. Stability takes time when disruption has been prolonged. Some nights were quiet in ways that felt heavy. Some mornings felt sharper than necessary. But something important returned quickly. Clarity. No one asked me questions I could not answer. No one spoke for me. No one decided what I would tolerate. The neighborhood adjusted. The house became calm again. The truth did not explode. It settled. And Sophie learned something she had never planned for. Control only works when the person being controlled believes they are irrelevant to the outcome. I was never irrelevant.